I'd like to start this video by saying that this is not a hate video. I don't hate South Park. I'm more concerned about it. So this is not a hate video, it's more of a concern video. Now, what am I concerned about? Well, there are several points that I would like to discuss in this video. The first one of which is that South Park doesn't take itself seriously. Now, whenever I bring this up in any discussions online, I'm usually met with, well, it's a comedy programme, comedy shouldn't take itself seriously. Now, not only is this just wrong in itself, because comedy is an art form like any other, and art is a serious thing, but also South Park takes itself seriously. There's an episode of South Park called You're Getting Old. It talks about serious topics like depression, and it takes them seriously. But it's also very funny as well, so you can take a serious topic seriously and be funny about it. You can do that. It may seem like a bit of an oxymoron, but it is possible because South Park has done it on multiple occasions. Now, I think You're Getting Old did something very special in South Park because it did something that it doesn't do very often, which is take something seriously. And because of that, the majority of South Park fans that I've spoken to seem to believe that that is one of the best episodes of the show. The majority of people put it in their top 10, and I myself say that it's one of my favourites. So, could you imagine if a whole season was as good as that episode? I think it'd be good, really, wouldn't it? Now, why do they not do that? Why do they not do that on a more constant basis? Well, I think it is because Trey Parker and Matt Stone are a little bit afraid of change. Now, do I have any evidence for this? Yes, I do. There are a couple of episodes I'd like to talk about. The first one is the sequel to You're Getting Old, the part 2. It's called Asperger's. That's a very funny joke. Now, for the majority of the episode, it's following in the vein of the previous one. It's taking itself seriously while still being funny, and the whole episode is about Stan getting used to these changes in his life, and by the end he's about to accept the changes and about to move on with his life and lead a happy one, when Randy pulls up in his car and reverts the entire episode back to the beginning, thereby destroying any chance of change and progression that the show had, which is a shame, because it was heading in a really interesting place, and then they just pretended it never happened. And I think Trey and Matt have kind of combated this with the recent post-COVID special, which has basically, they've now got an excuse to not make any changes, because this is set, I think about, is it 40 years in the future? 50? Something like that? So it's set a long time in the future, and the majority of the characters haven't changed. Cartman has changed, that's the joke, but all the other characters have got all the same problems that they had during their life. Kyle is still very lonely, Stan is still a very sad, depressed person, Tweak is still a jittery little thing, and Craig doesn't care about anything. And these are all characters that had a lot of potential and could have, had a lot of character progression, but now they've shown us the future and everything is exactly the same. So now, that's it, that's the end. No more character progression in South Park. And that's very sad, because there's a lot of potential in those characters. Now, I don't know why they are afraid of it, because there's something that has been discussed a lot, is the fact that South Park is pretty much uncancelable at this point. Now, when people usually talk about this, they're talking about the fact that South Park can make any offensive jokes that it wants and remain uncancelled. And that is true, but I think it's also uncancelable in other ways, such as format-wise. Like, it could make an enormous format change and it would survive. I mean, I genuinely think that they could broadcast an entire season of South Park that was just reruns of the X-Files, just called South Park. They could do that, and they'd get away with it. And so there's a lot of power that they have, and they're not using it. They're not using the power to doing anything interesting, because they could do anything with South Park, and it would survive. And unless they do make some kind of change, it's just going to sort of die, not go off air, but it'll just kind of go the way of The Simpsons and just become very flat and just boring and bland, which is heading for at the moment, I think. Now, what can we maybe do about this? Well, I think if Trey and Matt are too lazy to write their own stories, which I don't think they are, but they aren't doing it at the moment, and if their excuse for not doing it is they're too lazy, they could always use fanfictions. Now, it would be a very sad day when we can say that fanfictions of a show are better than the show. Unfortunately, that day is today when it comes to South Park, because the fanfictions are better at the moment, at least on a particular website called Archive of Our Own, which is a fanfiction website. It's essentially Wattpad if there was quality control and spell check, and there's also actually good writers on it as opposed to Wattpad. Now, one of these good writers is called Sir Weston, and he's written several stories, some of which are far too dark to actually be put on the show, but there's one which I think catches a nice sort of middle ground called Smoke on the Water, named after the Deep Purple song, which I believe plays at some point in the story. You don't hear it, of course, you can't hear words. I suppose you're hearing words now. But anyway, it's irrelevant. It's set in a kind of summer camp. The characters are a bit older, they're in their teenage years, and it's more serious in parts. I'm not going to discuss anything in depth because you should just read it. I will link it in the description for you to read. But at points it's funnier, or as funny as the show is, and at points it's much darker and tackles much more serious issues like South Park does in You're Getting Old. But it's still a very funny story at times. The serious elements don't stop it from being funny. And this is something that I think people get wrong. They seem to think you can only be serious or only be funny, and you can do multiple. Now, am I really suggesting that they make an adaptation of this fanfiction for television? Not really. It would be nice, it would be better than the show is at the moment, but ideally they would just write the show better. It's more just of an example because it illustrates what South Park can be capable of in the right hands. It tackles serious issues while remaining funny, which is something that is commonly attributed to something called topical comedy. I think there are two types of what people call topical comedy, and they call them both topical comedy when I believe they're separate things. One is topical comedy and time capsule comedy, which is a phrase that I've just invented. It's probably already been used because it's quite obvious, but basically topical comedy is when comedy discusses serious social and political issues while still making jokes about them, but tackles them in a serious way, takes them seriously. Whereas time capsule comedy is more comedy that makes fun of people and things that are famous at the time. So we're using South Park as an example. Topical South Park is when they do episodes about immigration or terrorism or things like that. And time capsule comedy is when they do episodes about Kanye West and Prince Harry. That's time capsule, that's not topical. And one isn't necessarily better than the other, but topical comedy stands the test of time better. I mean, I can watch those 20-year-old episodes about terrorism, about 9/11, and it's still just as relevant to today, whereas I imagine in 20 years, the episodes they've done recently about Kanye West and Prince Harry probably won't be as relevant. And so although they may well be as funny now, in 20 years no one will know what they're talking about. Unless they do research beforehand, which I think people should do, but people don't. So that's really all I have to talk about. Again, this is not a hate video. I wouldn't be making this video if I hated South Park, because I wouldn't care about it. You'll never see me making a video like this about Family Guy, because I couldn't care less about Family Guy. But I like South Park, and when it's at its best, it's one of the greatest shows on television. Unfortunately, at the moment, it is very far from its best. Now, if anyone watching this is in any South Park Discord servers or Facebook groups or anything like that, I'd like you to share this video around, because I know that Trey and Matt do spend time in the online South Park world, and this video may well make their way to them one day. I highly doubt it will, but it might, and if it does, Trey and Matt, please make your show better, because one day you are going to die, and if you want your show to go out on a low, you should carry on doing exactly what you're doing now. Whereas if you want to go on a high, you should actually try. Bye.